So I just would like to start with the question that somehow was the one that I was kind of, I don't know, that had a kind of resonance. I don't know if you say this in English, in me. How can we go, how is it possible to go a step further from very general platitudes and expressions that, you know, somehow we are also a bubble here. And how can we go a step further?
Okay, so Ashish is asking me to go first. But Heike, that question that you were highlighting from the chat now, it was my question. So I cannot answer it. I was asking it, the question about how to go beyond general platitudes, because I think, yeah, I think sometimes it does seem that when we're looking for alternatives, we say things like, we want an alternative, we want to stand in solidarity with people, we want to have an environmentally sustainable solutions. And yeah, I think it's really hard to have a dialogue at this level with people from so many different spaces, but also to not just say very general things. So that was a question I was actually posing. So I can't pretend to answer it, I'm afraid. Maybe Ashish has some more practical suggestions. I mean, I guess I would say, I think it's important to have these discussions which bring together people from very diverse spaces. But then we need to go after that to ask much more specific and particular questions, because the nature of the space means that some of the ideas might be at a very general level.
Yeah, sure. I'm sorry I missed the earlier discussion. What I say may not be completely relevant, but I'm maybe carrying on also from yesterday's session. Sorry, should I go on, Heike?
Yes, sure.
Okay. Okay, so I maybe three ideas here, 3 or 4 ideas. One is a much better documentation and understanding of the alternatives that already exist. And this could be in so many different fields. If we have an energy issue, then there are grounded, decentralized energy, renewable energy options available. Initiatives that are already there, energy sovereignty, etc. If it is food production, if it is urban sustainability and mobility issues, if it's, I don't know, direct democracy and governance. I think this kind of a network, one of its first steps could be to help document and understand and spread much more widely the grounded practical initiatives that already exist. Like the examples, some of the examples I gave, Shushi and I gave yesterday. And we have these in virtually every part of the world. There may be a few, there may be lots, but they're there, except that they're not well known. Most of them are not very well known. So that's number one. Secondly, with the people who are involved with that, to actually do some kind of analysis of what are the principles that have been used in getting to the solutions that they have gotten to. What challenges did they face? How did they overcome those challenges? How do they deal with a larger system that might be against what they're doing, hostile to what they're doing? How have they managed to maybe negotiate with the system or continue resisting it? So these are parts of an analysis that we could jointly do with the local. It shouldn't be like a top-down research kind of thing, but with these communities and the initiatives and NGOs to do that. Then on the basis of that, to do what yesterday I mentioned briefly, the outscaling, which is that, you know, if I learn from one of these initiatives, what they did and how they did it and the principles, then to come back into my own community or my own collective or my own city neighborhood and say, okay, how can I apply that, or how can we apply that in our context with our unique ecologies, with our unique economic and cultural systems, etc. So that modification, which is why We don't talk about replication, and we don't talk about upscaling an initiative to become bigger and bigger and bigger, but outscaling, which is really just learning from other initiatives and adapting it to our own contexts and situations. And we do quite a lot of that in the Indian context, for instance, helping network between collectives and communities so that learning can happen, and then they start something there. And if they're struggling, there is a little bit of a network available for them, for us to support what they're doing. Maybe further information, maybe further contacts, maybe a larger network of resistance, etc. The third thing is collectively dealing with the larger system, because whether we like it or not, these bubbles will remain only bubbles unless we are also dealing with the macroeconomic and macro political situation. So that needs platforms like the one we explained yesterday. It needs platforms at local, national, regional, and global levels that can actually help to deal with that system. Now, dealing with the system could be in the form of resistance, when the system is cracking down on you, trying to stop what you're doing. It could be in the form of trying to get policy shifts, such as, for instance, some of what's happening, a lot of what's happening in Europe and right now in the US with the change situation, where a lot of attempt is trying to actually make legal and policy shifts that would make the alternatives much more possible on the ground. So I think these are some of the things I can think of. And dealing with the system would also be, when I say resistance, it's not just resistance to the state. It's also resistance to powerful corporations. Now that could be in the form of things like campaigns for disinvestment, campaigns for account holders of banks to make the banks accountable, campaigns for boycotting certain products that are extremely harmful. All of that, to my mind, is practical action, which is based on the larger understanding of what needs to be done. So these are just some ideas. Now, of course, this will still sound abstract, but one can go into a lot of examples of where this is happening, practical examples.
Sally, this has been exposed yesterday, actually. So, but you still had this question. So, why? What do you think about that?
Okay, just to say, sorry, my internet is unstable, so I lost connection. I missed some of what you said, Ashish, and I might disappear again. Sorry, I hope it stays stable. Yeah, I think I have that question because I think it is a difficult question. It's one of these difficult questions of moving from the local to the global and trying to communicate on these big platforms. Some of the things I was thinking about resonate with what Ashish was saying is that I definitely, he was talking about more documentation of existing alternatives. In addition to that documentation, I think we also still need some more research about what people mean by some of the terms that we are using, like, and somebody was also having a private chat with me just now on this issue. So I'm not so sure sometimes that we know that people are using terms like Ubuntu or Sumakhausai or Buen Vivir to articulate alternatives, but sometimes I'm not quite sure. I think there's a diversity of meaning in terms of what people mean, and that it's valuable to know what people actually mean by these terms and how they relate that to more mainstream development. I was reading an interesting paper about, which is a very old academic paper looking at a Yoruba community that had a particular term which meant things like enlightenment and advancement and things like that. But that term came to mean something different when mainstream development moved into the community and came to actually take on connotations of roads and schools. So these terms change and people's aspirations change as well. So I think it's quite important to also perhaps, in addition to documenting what we already know, also to have more research on how people who are relatively marginalized envisage the future and what it is that they envisage when asked, how would you like to see your life improve? Because I think we will find that there are a diversity of perspectives, that there are people who will articulate that with reference to wanting alternatives to mainstream development, wanting to live lives which are characterized by food sovereignty, by living closely and harmoniously with nature, but also from my own research and observations, many people will articulate far more conventional views around development of wanting roads and houses and schools and electricity, and sometimes things that maybe those working in this field have come to regard as environmentally not sustainable. And then there needs to be some dialogue there. So I think sometimes in these alternative spaces, there's a mistake is made to portray those in the global south as if those in the global south all uniformly reject mainstream development. And I don't think that they do. Certainly in South Africa, that's not the case. But then how do we take seriously when communities say what we want is a road, what we want is a car and a Western style housing? I mean, how do we take those demands seriously while also being attentive to the good reasons for seeking for alternatives? So yeah, those were some preliminary thoughts I had. And I think there's also, for this kind of discussion, I'm not sure what everybody who's part of this discussion, what your positions are and what role you have. But I think there are also some important questions about what role there are for relatively privileged individuals in the global north in these struggles. Is there a role at all? If so, what is that role? And then also for even, elite actors like activists and civil society, people in civil society, academics in the global south, what role do we have? Because it cannot be assumed that we have a role, and if so, we also need to think carefully about what role that is in these popular struggles to attain, to improve people's lives. It's not very clear what the role of people who are perhaps beneficiaries of mainstream development, what role they might play in those popular struggles. That's all from me.
Thank you, sir. Ashish, did you want to reply?
Yeah, quickly, maybe the 3 points, at least as far as I could make out, three very important points that Sally has brought up. One is the understanding of terms. I completely agree with that, because we all come from different cultural contexts and language contexts. And so what well-being might mean to you might be very different from, or what happiness means to you might be different from what it means to me. And this is one of the things that we were talking about yesterday was therefore the importance of cross-cultural dialogue and actual dialogue, not debate, where we spend the time that is necessary to understand each other better. And by we, I don't necessarily mean only people like us who are on this call, but also communities. So, and this relates maybe to the third point is, do we, as those who have the privileges to be able to be on a call like this, can we use some of those privileges to enable community to community exchange? I'll give you an example of what happened about a decade back. The Dalit women farmers about which I spoke yesterday, who have created an amazing food sovereignty revolution in South India, they visited the Parque de la Papa, which is the potato farmers in Peru, who are doing something very, very similar, maintaining, managing, governing their entire biocultural landscape and growing 1,300 varieties of potato. So these women went there, the people from there came here. And it's through that interaction and exchange, despite the language barriers, that they actually learned quite a lot. These women picked up the idea of doing a restaurant, a local foods restaurant, which the Parque de la Papa people were already running. And those people picked up how to make films So the community people there make films learning from these women here. Now, that's an expensive exchange. Okay, it's not a cheap exchange, and it's a difficult one also because it's language barriers and things like that. It's only people like us who can actually enable something like that to happen. Communities on their own will not be able to do it, but we are then enabling and then stepping back. We're not being the mediators. We're not actually then speaking on their behalf, and I think that's really, really powerful. The other thing is the co-option that happens with the terms. Oh, and incidentally, one of the, as a nice aside, one of the things they learned to their total surprise was that Earth, Mother Earth, was called, I think, Pachamama by the Peruvian indigenous Quechua people. And here the Telugu term in South India was Panchamma. Now, isn't that amazing, right? So more or less the same thing being called for Mother Earth or Sacred Earth. Anyway, so I think the other issue with that is the co-option that takes place, which I think also, Sally, you kind of indicated. So for instance, Buen Vivir has been co-opted by the nation states in whether it's Ecuador or Bolivia and so on, whether in the constitution or in their laws. But they mean, the state means something very, very different from what the original indigenous concept was. And many of the indigenous movements have been pointing this out, saying that you people have just co-opted our term. We don't accept the way you are interpreting it, in which even oil exploration and mining becomes part of Buen Vivir, which is ridiculous, right? So one has to always be careful of that and always kind of assert what we think is the really, say the progressive revolutionary part of the terms that we're using. In India, Swaraj, which I talked about yesterday, is the same thing. The state is trying to co-opt that term. The second issue about people in the global south wanting mainstream development, absolutely. And this also came up yesterday. Somebody had asked this question. And I think this is where it's useful for us to go a little bit deeper into what the real want or desire is. Is it access to the outside world, which gets translated into a 4-lane highway, but could actually get translated into other forms of access, which could be, a simple small village path, which then connects to a highway much further. It doesn't have to be the 4-lane highway going to every village in the country, which is what the mainstream guys want, because that's how they'll make their money, right? And keep their power. If it's energy, the basic need is energy, not necessarily electricity. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have electricity, but energy can come in many different forms. Even electricity can come in many different forms. It doesn't have to be the central grid, which then has these transmission lines coming into the village. It could be a local microgrid built on solar or wind or whatever other local sources available, and also non-electricity forms of energy. Passive solar buildings, for instance, in northern India in the cold climate have been extremely successful in maintaining internal heat without any electricity being used. So not to ever say, no, you can't have this. We can have it, but you can't have it because it will destroy the environment, which is like a narrow environmentalist view. But to say, yes, these are genuine needs, but here are possible alternative ways to meet that, where in fact, if you adopt it, you might be showing us the way of becoming more sustainable, us as in people living in cities or in the global north. And I think that brings us to the incredible roles that we can play. I think we do have legitimate, we as in the global north, which means people like me also in the south who are privileged or rich or have access to a laptop, etc. Where I think, like the first thing I said, enabling the voices from the ground, helping to support the movements on the ground which are otherwise threatened by the system without co-opting those movements, enabling connections. For instance, if a local community is fighting against a mining project, enabling the connection with a lawyer in India's Supreme Court for them to be able to fight directly in the Supreme Court, etc. I mean, I think these are the sorts of things, the roles that we can play, and much greater analysis conducted in a participatory way with the local communities, bringing our knowledge into those communities because they often don't have that. Like with COVID. COVID is an amazing example of where local communities don't know how to respond because they've never faced this challenge before. So bringing that relevant knowledge, but making them participants so that maybe they also evolve solutions to COVID and the economic lockdown and building more immunity in the body and things like that. So, I mean, again, just ideas that I'm throwing out.
Thank you. So it's quite challenging, but interesting. When Joscha was preparing this Metimeter for the questions, I was talking about the terms now that I sometimes everybody here talking about Pachamama. It's driving me a bit nervous because I'm kind of it's not that easy because it's a very challenging term when it's challenging us this anthropocentric way of thinking and seeing, and we are just I say it again. I said it yesterday. I found it so great. Sanchip saying, from his context, when all the questions about relationship between nature and human beings, he just said, nature is first. Then came another question, and how do you think, how do you want? Nature is first. And for me, it was kind of, yes, that's obvious. And, and I think that it's challenging us now talking about global north, because the term buen vivir, as you said, Ashish, or Pachamama is now so common. And then it's kind of, it's all the same. That was what I was saying kind of when Joscha was preparing and saying what I'm now thinking about, that we are often kind of trying to say, it's the same. Yeah, that's it. Okay, no, it's not the same. And I think that's for me a great challenge also to say, no, we need, and now I'm talking about this question about the global north. In the global north, let us challenge ourselves. And this challenging, it's challenging our ways of life, because it's so easy to say, okay, we have to change, but this change is a great challenge. It's a challenge that challenges our way of thinking, perceiving the relationship with each other, with the nature, etc. So it's this modern pattern of, if you want to say so, and I think that is one thing that I find it interesting that both of you were mentioning this, and now another question that is now in the chat and was also on our when we made this Metimeter, was about once again about the global structures. Ashish was also already talking about this, but maybe to go into to deepen this question again. And before that, just let's read me a first comment. That was a comment from David Ordóñez, que antes, sorry, mixing up the languages, who made this comment to the first question that was kind of linking with what you were answering to, but just reading the comment from the chat. And now I will switch to Spanish, sorry for that translation. Ya no es la pregunta acerca de cómo avanzar y qué hacer ahora antes de esto, ya lo estamos haciendo.
You said it already, what this is about. We are moving forward already. But where are the differences? What's converging? How do we face that power, and where are the limits for our practices, and how is it handled in other parts of the world? What kind of exchange is there, the collective, the common things between generation, the participation from now on, learning, listening, those are the important things, democratic structures, new ways of learning to deal with food stuff. What does life look if you're far away from
everything? And now the question. okay, we're already in this way, and this was what you were saying, but one of the big questions, and that also came up in the questions that we were collecting, is about politics and global structures. How can we link these examples of alternatives, especially also from the global south, to the question that we had at the beginning of our conference presented by Aram Ziai about questions of power, hegemony, and all the political and socio-economic structures. How can all these, how can we go and change all these structures? And let me add a question, because what about politics? You know, we had Alberto Acosta, who is also a politician, and today in the morning we had a morning chant and input from one Kenyan who says, a young PhD student who says, I want to become the minister from Kenya because she wants to change things from within. So how about participating in these structures? You know, what do we think about this? Because we have been talking much about the grassroots movements, alternatives. What do we think about this changing from within? Because we also had this presentation yesterday from the ministry, Claudia Warning from the Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development, the German ministry. And I found it quite interesting, sorry for that, Tuto, that when Tuto made a short summary today of what we were listening, discussing, and talking about yesterday, he mentioned every presentation, but not the presentation from Claudia Warning from the ministry, because sometimes we very much focus on the grassroots movements, on the different, these alternatives, etc. So how can we change the power and hegemonial structures, and what about political activism? So who wants to go first?
Sally, go ahead. I already spoke quite a lot in the last one.
Yeah, I'm trying to gather my thoughts from all of these different questions. I think if I pick up on both what Ashish was saying and some of the questions that have come now about politics and global structures, and if I think particularly about those, I think the majority of the people attending here are, although they're people from all over, are living in Germany, in Europe. So one question could be, what do you do? What can be done from where you are? I think that one of the insights that we had from the very first presentation when Aram spoke was around how the global economy is structured in such a way that wealth is still flowing from the global south to the global north. And yet often when we are thinking, when people in the global north are thinking about what to do to address poverty and inequality, they think in terms of helping the poor, helping those in the global south. But if we acknowledge that the problem is, the reason for poverty and inequality is to do with global economic structures, then a lot of the most important activism should actually take place there. So for example, the EU, in the way that the EU conducts trade relations with the rest of the world, is very disadvantageous to other countries. When you have to enter into trade negotiations as an African country with the EU, and they come with their 43 lawyers, and the trade relations end up being incredibly skewed. And sometimes I think some of the most important activism must take place within Europe, and that often people, privileged actors within Europe can be more effective there than to come and help people in the global south who I think that the struggles in the global south will be best led and driven by local actors. So that's perhaps one point. I don't know if it quite answers your question around politics. And I'm dodging the question a little bit as to what those of us in the global south then need to do, which is different. And again, there might, there might be a wide range of things. The other thing that is more complicated, it was an interesting point that Ashish made about, when people say they want mainstream development, we need to interrogate what they actually want. And this, I think, is an incredibly important question. And it reminds me of a conversation that the anthropologist James Ferguson records with someone in Lesotho many years ago, Mr. Lebona. And they had this conversation where Mr. Lebona was very proud because he was building a Western style house. And James Ferguson, who's the Western anthropologist, says to him, but why don't you build a local house? Because the local materials are more available and they are better environmentally. Why do you want this brick house with a tin roof? And with 4 rooms and so on. And the guy, Mr. Lebona, looks to James Ferguson and he says, what house does your father back in America have? Does it have brick walls? Is it a mud house? Does it have a straw roof? And James Ferguson is forced to say, no, it's a brick house, it has a roof. And then Mr. Lebona says, yes, well, that is the direction we want to move into. And the way that the interpretation of this conversation that James Ferguson has reflected on is that part of what Mr. Lebona wants is to insist on the comparability of his life with the life of James Ferguson. Why should you have something that I don't have? Why are you telling me to live in a way that you do not live in? And because of the global power inequalities and wealth inequalities, often people's sense of advancing in the world and of being equal and asserting that equality is tied up with the achievement of Western style development. To say that I'm equal is to say that I must live in this kind of house, that I must use this kind of transport. To use public transport is to show that I'm poor. To use a car is to show that I have made it. But what that means also is that if there were changes in the ways of life of those who are more privileged, that takes away that need for an insistence of equality to come with, well, to be equal means I must consume resources the way you consume resources. So that's why the conversations around degrowth and things like that in Europe are, I think, important, because if it is the case that people consume in this very conspicuous way, and then when people from other parts of the world are trying to assert equality in a world that continually tells them that you are worth less, their aspirations are going to be articulated in ways that mirror the aspirations of the wealthy in the world. So I suppose the comment that I'm making there is that a lot of the time the change that needs to happen is not necessarily a change that needs to happen in the global south. It's a change that needs to happen in the policies of the north, in the practices of the north, and within countries also perhaps in the policies and practices of those of us who are relatively privileged in our spaces as well.
Yeah, totally agreed with what Sally just said. And Sally, yesterday in our discussion, one of the examples I'd given was of cycling in Europe and how that's in a way come back or, exploded in a big way, at least in some parts of Europe. And how I tell a lot of my urban youth colleagues that if we want to copy something from the West, then that's what should be copied, and not all the wrong stuff. But yeah, and of course, I think for the West to be able to, and not just the West, even as you said, the privileged in the South. So for the global North, which includes, as I said, people like me in the South, for us to do anything, we have to even as we support and enable and all of that, which I said earlier, we also have to challenge ourselves and the ways we live and the ways we think and the ways we talk and the ways we do things, even things like cultural hegemonies, language hegemonies. Why in India, for instance, even the poorest family wants to try and send their kid to an English medium school because they know that in the competitive world outside, that's probably what will give them a little bit of an edge. And then these kids, they land up in the middle of two stools because neither can they speak good English, nor have they learned their own mother tongue well enough to be able to get back maybe into their own community. So, I mean, it's a really dire situation. So I totally agree with you. Maybe building on that and looking at politics per se, from the economic, also political sphere, and trying to address that question. I think, again, one of the things we really need to do all across the world is to unlearn what we think of democracy. We have almost 100% of us have fallen into the trap that democracy is about electing a government into power, a party into power. Whereas, like I was trying to say yesterday, democracy is about us claiming power to ourselves. But the power not to dominate, so it's not power over, but the power to, or the power with, so the power to do something good with you, the power, and so it comes with the responsibility, the rights and the responsibilities part of it. And I think that unlearning is really, really, really important. And even in the COVID context, to me, it seems to be so important that in India, the horrific situation that we're in right now with COVID is, of course, to do with the breakdown of public health systems, the complete lack of preparedness on part of the central and state governments, etc. All of that is the key to the problem. But there's another part to it, which is a little hard to talk about right now, given the situation we're in, which is that every one of us has willingly given over the responsibility of our own bodies also, and our collective health systems, either to the medical establishment or to the state, and the medical establishment more and more to the private sector. And so partly it's also our responsibility. Why do we not claim power over our own health, which would make us more immune, or our own collective health systems, which would enable oxygen to be available or good health systems to be available if something like the pandemic hits? But we don't do that. We have examples in India, in fact, where communities have done that and they've survived much, much better than the people in Delhi, the privileged people in Delhi who are dying as we see right now. So I think there's many lessons to be learned with regard to what we mean by democracy. And yesterday I gave the example of Swaraj. There's dozens of different kinds of governance systems, some from ancient times, some new ones, which are actually much deeper than the modern liberal sense of democracy or notion of democracy. And we need to understand those, support them, etc. Which is not to say that all traditional systems of governance were necessarily equitable. No, many times women were not involved. Ancient Greek democracy, slaves were not involved, etc. So we can interrogate them also, but not throw them out, like throw out the baby with the bathwater, saying, okay, these are all primitive and we have to have electoral democracy everywhere in the world. I mean, I think we need really to go more fundamental into that, like Swaraj, as I mentioned yesterday. The second part is, yes, even as we do that, even as we fundamentally challenge the notions of political governance right now, including nation states, like I said yesterday, and the boundaries of nation states to be challenged on ecological and cultural grounds, we still have to deal with the current system. So we could be revolutionaries, but we can't sit back and say, okay, let the revolution come and then I'll do something. We have to also work with the current system. And that means, yes, working within and working to create more and more cracks in the current system, open up more and more of the system, fight for rights-based legislation and policies, fight for more accountability, fight for more transparency, make the system more accountable to us, even as we fundamentally challenge the nature of the state and politics itself. So I don't think there's any contradiction between these two. We can be doing both. I could be doing one thing, you could be doing the other, and we work together to make sure that there is some sort of synergy in this. The last thing is on sort of local to global connections with regard to politics. I think one of the biggest questions we're asking ourselves, and nobody has all the answers, is what would global political governance look like? We know the United Nations has been very useful in some aspects. For instance, a number of the environmental treaties and so on, but it has also failed fundamentally in many other aspects. I mean, currently it's failing to deal with the climate crisis as an example. And one of the reasons for that is that it's a United Nations, it's nation states that form that body. Peoples of the world who are contained within the nation states don't have a voice. They can have a peripheral voice in the civil society platforms that are available within the US system, but they don't really have a decision-making voice. So how do we build either a complementary or a parallel people's assembly, a global people's assembly of some kind, which is grassroots up and which doesn't become a concentration of power at the global level itself? Not a global parliament, not a global government, but a global people's assembly, which is truly based on grassroots. It's a big question. I don't have the answers to all of this, but I think it's worth looking at. And building those local to global connections, the examples I can think of are, for instance, in Europe, the network of fearless cities, where feminist municipalism has got connected up through different cities where, you know, it could be the parties or the mayors or the local civil society organizations and people's movements who are trying to create regions and zones where, for instance, refugees can come and live a dignified life as part of the decision-making process. It's not fully direct and radical democracy, but I think it's kind of getting there. Or there was supposed to be a tour of the Zapatista, which I talked about yesterday, and all of you know about them. The Zapatista movement, radical direct democracy, they were going to do a tour across Europe to link up with groups that are also trying to get direct democracy working in Europe, in cities or in rural areas. Because of COVID, that tour has been postponed. But, you know, that's the kind of connections that I think we need to make more and more, to learn from each other and express solidarity with each other, to make a very different kind of politics also happen. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashish. A question. So, and how can we, or maybe now I as a member of an academy organizing such an event. So how can I and how can we go such a step further? Because, you know, for example, we really tried hard to enable participation really from the ground, because I have good connections, and we already had dialogue moments together with indigenous people from the Amazon base in Latin America. And so we have now this online event. It's for free in order to really create a free space for all, etc. So, and then, okay, several wanted to participate, indigenous leaders. Then, okay, first, how to ensure it? There is no good internet, so I bought credit for their mobile phones in order to enable them, because you can buy it on the internet, isn't it? So you just buy it. And so we bought and then now there's a rain season and it's just impossible to take part, you know, just like this, you know, and so trying hard, but it's on the end, and these people really from the ground couldn't participate. And I think that's often, and when then it comes, we invite indigenous leader. What does this mean? Then often it's the same voices, because who can speak, as you said, you know, the language, etc. So I found it, you know, and now it's a really personal question, because now we were trying so hard, and we really tried to make it possible. So in a very practical way. So, and what is the next step to do? You know, also now talking about, yeah, okay.
You want me to answer that?
It's just a comment, you know, it's just a comment like, I don't think there's really an answer, but it's also kind of, you know, it's always, you know, so nice to say, enabling the voices on the ground, and, you know, and then there's rain season, you know, and it's just like, yeah, but enabling these connections, it's always, you know, it's always so nice to write it in a project, so nice to write it in a paper, but, you know, then in an article, but then maybe it's just a comment from my side. So there are lots of questions, so let's go on.
Can I maybe, I don't know, Sally, do you want to comment on that? Or I have a quick comment. Go ahead.
Okay, Ashish. Go ahead, Ashish. I can comment afterwards.
Okay, no, again, not an answer, but I think firstly, this issue of not being able to get hold of people on the ground on the internet, I think that's our problem. I'm not necessarily sure it's their problem. And if the rain has interrupted this season, you can always try it a little later. I think this is also a question of how we look at time. You know, we with our projects, and I'm including myself here, not pointing fingers at you only. We with our projects and our deadlines and our academic, whatever, you know, is being imposed on us or which we have self-imposed, work at a very different time scale than what local communities work at. And if we really want to be truly respectful, we'll have to adjust our time frames to theirs. So if it hasn't worked this rainy season, try it in the winter. If it doesn't work, try it next year. Which means we have to adjust our frames rather than they. They are living their lives, okay, in whatever way, and they've been living it for hundreds or thousands of years. Lots of universities and professors, and I'm sure some of you are involved with that, are also building alternative pedagogies. So even before thinking of getting local communities from the global south to talk to us, etc., how do we actually create course material, ways of teaching and learning, etc., which fundamentally challenge the Western way of doing things anyway, right? Again, like yesterday I said, fundamentally challenging, transforming the education system itself. Why do we think, if I'm a European or an American and I'm sitting in a big city in India, why do I think that I'm born with privilege? It's because that's what I'm always being told. That, yeah, you have the power to do these things, and you know, those poor people, they don't, because for whatever XYZ reasons. So I think challenging that, building the history of colonialism, how much of colonial history is actually taught in the schools and colleges in Europe, and what colonization has meant. Why are refugees coming to Europe, and what is the colonial history behind that? These are the sorts of things that I think need to go much more into alternative courses, pedagogies, and we actually have a global group called Pedagogue, post-development academic activist global group. I think Aram is part of that. This is where, you know, exchanging materials and ways of learning, unlearning, etc., that's happening, and especially in the global north. And the politics of representation is a very difficult one. It's very, very tricky. I know that, for instance, I was involved for about 15 years with the International Convention on Biological Diversity. And there used to be people from indigenous groups, especially in Latin America. They're much more well mobilized than from South Asia, who would come. But then it would almost always be the same person, or the same 2 or 3 people who would come. And then sometimes we would get information back from their own people saying that, you know, there's internal hierarchies. You know, why is it that only that person is going? So that's a very difficult one. And again, that's a partly at least a question of time. How much time do each one of us have to provide to actually go to that community, to understand the politics in that community, the hierarchies in that community, and maybe enable other voices, rather than just sitting wherever we are and saying, okay, here's the person. Because this is typically what development, mainstream development also does, right? So you want to have rural development, you go and talk to the village chief, and he or she says, mostly he, we'll say, okay, this is what the village needs. And you say, oh, look, we've done our consultation and this is what the village needs. So you can't do these things in 3-year and 5-year project cycles. These are long drawn out processes, and it means that deep involvement, which is the only way to break through the politics of representation, I think.
Yeah, that's a bit, Alberta Costa said this, when someone from the village said, okay, that's nice, you have nice concepts, and now come here, sit down and let's talk to each other. So Sally, you wanted to say? Did you want to comment? Otherwise, I would just read some comments from the chat.
Sorry, I lost you there with the internet, but I think just as a small comment, the one is that I think that often those of us working in privileged spaces want to have a sort of we want to be representative, and so we want to invite somebody to attend or whatever, but sometimes I think maybe it's sometimes our need to satisfy ourselves that we have included people, and sometimes the people that we are inviting don't see the value in the thing we are doing. I'll give an example. I was writing editing a book on NGOs and social movements, and I didn't want to only have the voices of academics and NGOs, but also more the voices of activists, and so I was trying to include those voices, and I found a way in some ways, but in some ways being part of a book is just not important. To it's a priority for me, and I want to say I included people's voices, but maybe the people whose voices I wanted in the book are not interested in being in a book. It's not what their struggle is at the moment. It's not something, and I have to respect that and say, well, maybe they feel that their energies are better spent elsewhere and contributing to so sometimes it's that. And also, I agree fully with Ashish's point about representation. I think that's why sometimes these things take a lot of careful and hard work, because I've seen in the social movement spaces in South Africa that often it's actually people like me who write those statements. You know, when you see these statements from the shack dwellers movement or the unemployed movement, when you work closely, you find out who's actually writing those statements. It's often either privileged actors within those movements, or even people. I've been asked to write statements, I'll be honest, and sometimes, I don't know how to respond to those kinds of requests, but sometimes it's even affiliated academics. And so what that means, though, is that there's complicated politics of representation, because there are so many layers of hierarchy and privilege, and often the people who do come and attend a space like this, or do write a statement or run some of these movements, are able to have websites, and who run the website, you'll often find that they're relatively privileged actors in those spaces. And that's why I agree with what Ashish is saying. It takes a long time to build those alliances and to work in those spaces, because otherwise there can be quite superficial engagement without realizing the complexities of whose voice within those community-based movements, whose voice is being heard, and what the diversity of positions are within those spaces, because those are complex spaces as well.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's really very important, and also really to take into account actually the great disappointment of was that I posted it on the internet, on the Facebook, and they themselves wanted to participate. And they themselves were the ones who registered, and I saw their names. And so that's, that's when you think, wow, great. And then, but yeah, I think that's something I really have to think more about what you say. I want them to be part of a book, but is it my interest, or what is the criteria behind the endeavors? Okay, so now I want to read some comments. There was, for example, a comment about language. So who can participate if the language is just English, Spanish, German? One comment is, I think especially academic teaching needs to acknowledge and open up to our knowledges from different contexts and different ways of teaching, learning as well as the notion of unlearning much more, stepping out of our acquired frames and trying to create open spaces for deep and meaningful encounter, dialogue and inquiry are vital in the quest for a good life for all that leaves no one behind. It is not only important what we teach and learn, but also the way which we do so. Fostering a critical global citizenship education can greatly support offering and finding alternative ways of teaching and learning about development. Another one, the academy will make sense to the extent that is involved in the profound transformations that are taking place. Therefore, students must be involved in these planetary conversations from the beginning so that they learn diversity beyond their own realities. An academic who does not mobilize for transformations against inequality is preaching in a vacuum. Another one, we are learning new ways and senses of doing politics, political parties and state structures responding to the North and to Eurocentric practices, defending their own interests. And it is really clear that what they produce is inequality. That is why the changes must be in new practices of relationship between us and nature. This implies mobilizations for the rights of all. Rights must be won. They will not be given for free. It is a struggle within our countries and the global level. Then the repressive system that is part of the neoliberal system as self-defense is a complex issue to face. The youth are contributing to the transformations, and this is implying repressions and death to remain without eyes, because the established order does not want to lose its interests, because they live of the inequality the system feeds on it. It is important to consider accessibility to ensure participation, but also consider that participation is not only asking to speak, giving speeches. We need, for example, to learn from how children participate by playing or learn new ways of learning, not the theory, but the practice, the experiences. And then there are questions about structures and economic fears, competition, and cooperation in economics. Somehow we were also talking about, and I think that some of the questions are now, and what we are already talking about was very much already linked to what do we need now? What are the consequences? What do we draw as conclusions from all these discussions for different contexts of practice? So this will be kind of then our final panel. I'm now giving the floor to it. And really want to thank again Ashish for contributions throughout the whole conference, and now your comments and answer. Thank you very much. Thanks to Sally. I think, as she said, she has internet problems, but she might join us again. So thank you, Ashish. Thanks to you all.